So today, what we are going to work on is finding the percentage of a total amount. Okay, so they give you some pretty real world application type problems. And what we're going to be doing is using decimals and percents to try and kind of find portions of things. All right. You'll see what I'm talking about in a second. This is a little bit of a word problem based lesson. So make sure that you're writing these down and kind of following along with each of those. If you need a pencil or a piece of paper, please let me know now. Need a piece of paper? Yeah, you can borrow that. And you can actually use the packets that are up there, the back of them, for scrap paper if you need. But anyway, so like I said, we're finding the percentage of a total amount. So first example says a chemist is using 337 milliliters of a solution. Okay. If 15.7% of the solution is salt, how many milliliters of salt are there? As a heads up, you're probably going to need to use a calculator. You're going to have to use some kind of calculating, program, whether it's Desmos, online calculator, phone, whatever you need. Because a lot of this is going to be able to use multiplication to kind of help us find these portions, right? A lot of the percentages we've seen in class so far have been like 25%, 50%. We're able to understand what that looks like, right? It's a quarter, it's a half, whatever it may be. Some of the percentages that we're working with now are going to be a little bit more funky, okay? So this first example, we'll take a look at two examples. This first one, what we have. We want to identify what the whole solution is, right? We talked about this back on Thursday, I believe. Understanding, well, how much of the total amount does he have? Because the total amount is pretty much going to be our denominator or what we're going to multiply something by, all right? So we have 337 milliliters of a total solution. Let's go through and just write that down first, all right? 337, and I'm putting that in parentheses because I'm actually going to end up multiplying that by something, all right? 15.7% of that is salt, and we're trying to find out, well, of this total, so 337 total milliliters of the solution, if 15.7% is salt, well, how many milliliters of salt are exact, right? How much do I exactly have? So the first thing that I do, and I'm going to put the notes here off to the side, is I'm going to convert the percent to a decimal. All right. That's going to be my first step. And we actually reviewed this a lot back on Friday in that Kahoot that we did with converting from a percent to decimal. What is 15.7% as a decimal? Where do I move my decimal point? To the left or to the right? What's that? It's not that you said anything wrong. It's just I cannot hear what you're saying. Right. Not to the right. So what's the other option? To the left, right? 50-50 shot. So I'm going to take that 15.7% and I'm going to convert it to a decimal by moving it to the left. So 15.7 as a decimal is 0.157. All right. So the first thing you do is convert that decimal, or excuse me, that percent to a decimal. Everybody with me so far? Now I'm going to take the 337, that total amount, and multiply it by my decimal. So multiply, my second step, the total by the decimal. Okay. So 337 times the 0.157, that converted percentage. And this is where that calculator is handy, or whatever you're going to use to help you kind of figure out what you need to. 337 times 0.157. Well, if you were to plug that into a calculator, you get 52.909. Can somebody confirm with me that that's what you get? Somebody type that in just to double check. You got it? So 52.909. Cool. Everybody with me so far? The last thing that I'm going to do is now round this to the nearest tenth. Okay? Because when you go into ALEKS and you have to actually type in your answer, It's going to ask you to round it to the nearest tenth. Remember, the tenth is that first point here, this first value after my decimal point. So 52.9, well, to round, I look at the number after that. If it's 4 and below, you let it go. Okay. So 52.9 would be my final answer. If it was 5 and above, you move it up. Okay. Because it is 4 or below, I'm leaving this as 52.9. So of this solution that this chemist makes, right? It's a solution made of whatever, like water and salt. 52.9 milliliters of it are salt out of the 337. Okay. Question. The nearest tenth. Right. So because the number after that 10th spot is less than 4, so this is 0 right here, I do nothing to this value. I just let it go. Any questions about the first example? Everybody good? My second example says chocolate bar contains 22% of cocoa. If the weight of the bar is 67 grams, how many grams of cocoa does it contain? Right? So when we think about total, I want you to answer this question for me. What's the total weight of this bar? It tells us in the problem, because that's the first thing that we want to find is the total. 67 grams, right? We don't want to confuse that with our percentage. So the first thing we're going to do is write the total, the 67. Okay. If I go back to my first example, right, I have a list of steps here. Bless you. Now what I want to do is convert the percent that I see in the problem to a decimal. Well, what's the percentage that's in my problem here? What do they tell me that the amount of cocoa is? What percent? It says this percent of the bar is cocoa. What number do you say? 22%, right? So I want to convert the 22% to a decimal. Well, what's 22% as a decimal? 0.22, right? You take the 22, move the decimal point 2 places to the left. So 0.22 is my decimal. And now I'm going to multiply that 0.22, right, by the total amount. So 67 times 0.22. And somebody tell me what the value is for that answer. So if you use a calculator or whatever you're using, 67 times 0.22 is what? 14.74, right? Any questions up until this point? The last step is to round this to the nearest tenth. Well, what number is in the tenths place right now? 7. Good. The number behind the 7, is that greater than, or is that 5 or greater, or 4 or less? 4 or less. So what do I do with this? Do I let it go, or do I round it up? Let it go, right? So my final answer is 14.7. Okay. And then that would be grams, right? So of the 67 gram chocolate bar, 14.7% of it, or 14.7 grams are cocoa, because that's 22%. All right. So you take the total, you convert your percentage to a decimal, multiply that new decimal and your total, and that's the amount that you have, right? This is what we do when we're trying to find percents of a total amount. Are there any questions about either of those two examples or anything that we covered today in class? Everybody good? Feel confident with this, or do we need to see another example? Anybody have any opinions? Okay.